you, everyone. I'm going to give you an overview of grass sealing and what we are doing. And because we're a little bit ahead of time, hopefully we will have some time for questions. I noticed that Blanca used this photo in her presentation as well, so you can tell that we all love it. This is from our first consortium meeting in Brussels. And I think there are a couple of things we do very well in our project. I think, first of all, it really is a participatory action research approach. So we have policymakers involved, we have stakeholder organisations. So this could be a farm women's organisation. In the Scottish case, it's the Scottish Crofting Federation that represent very small farmers. In Ireland, we have Macra na Firma, who represent the young farmers. So we have policy stakeholders that work with us, and they are kind of really central to the success of our living labs, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And in each of our living labs, we work with 8 rural and farm women innovators. And we have active engagement of policymakers, as well as kind of some senior European policymakers who are here. There are also policymakers from different countries at this forum, which is wonderful to see. So it really is a multi-actor approach. And we're learning from the women as well as learning about the women and using that to inform policy. And the forum today, which Blanca and Branwen have organised, is a really important channel for the project to kind of work with policymakers to see how we can realistically use the findings that are emerging to develop workable policies. Branwen, the next page, please. Next slide. So this is to give you an idea of where we're based. There's 9 participant countries. You can see there Ireland, Netherlands, Norway, Lithuania, Croatia, Spain, Sweden, Italy, and Scotland. Scotland for us is very interesting because in many ways they've really pushed ahead in advocating for women's equality in agriculture. We also have some really important EU partners who can help with the policy influence, and you can see them there. We have the Women's Entrepreneurship Platform, Copa Cogeca, ADL, and the European Environmental Bureau. The next slide, please, Branwen. And this is just to give you a sense of the activities. So that top slide is the Living Lab from Ireland. There's some from the Dutch Living Lab there. I have to say, for me, as an academic quite far on in my career, when I started to see all the photos coming in of the living labs across the 9 countries where we were working with these women and learning from them, I really felt quite emotional. It's just fabulous to see it working out so much on the ground. The next slide, please, Branwen. So at a high level, and I'll get into more detail in a minute, we're trying to understand more about women's role in agriculture, and we need to really try to figure out how we can transform the prevalent cultural and social norms and stereotypes around women's roles in farming and in rural areas. And to this end, we hope to contribute to developing better policies, better agricultural knowledge systems, and enhance women's capacity to innovate. And I think what I'm really heartened by is the really kind of favourable political and policy climate at the moment. I have never seen a policy context where there is a real commitment to advancing women's equality in agriculture to the extent there is now. We've seen it happen for STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I think there's a growing realization that actually agriculture has real problems of inequality that will not go away without a policy focus. So it's great to see how strongly it's written into the strategic direction of agriculture, which the European Union has recently published, and also to see how DG Agri are really trying to push it through some of their through common agricultural policy, national plans, and so on. The next slide, please, Branwen. So what are we doing? So we have 6 work packages that all interreact and interrelate in different ways. And we're doing different things in all of them that will inform policy. So we have identified what data is available in each of our participating 9 countries, and we've identified the gaps. We've also gathered data on some of the overarching kind of policy frameworks that impact women in our 9 countries. So we've looked at things like parental leave, maternity leave, because of course we have European policy, but we also have quite significant differences between the member states. And that will influence how they adopt European policies and so on. So we've kind of looked at what's available. We've identified gaps. We've also actively gathered data. So we have done a kind of statistical, quantitative overview, and then we have gathered qualitative data from men and women innovators to understand some of the differences between how rural and farm men and women obtain support, the different types of needs they have, to understand better the gender differences and obstacles. We've engaged in foresight analysis where we've looked to see what would make it better by 2040. What can we do? What would we like policy to have achieved by then? We're benchmarking policy documents. So we have developed tools and a webinar to look at how effectively key European policies are performing against the gender equality strategy and the aspirations of the gender equality strategy. So we've looked at the Common Agricultural Policy, the long-term vision for rural areas, the Food to Fork, and the Green Deal. We will have all of those completed by the end of this year. And we're doing this at both European and national level. We're also benchmarking legal frameworks across Europe. And I'm really pleased to see that the strategic direction for agriculture is actually called for information by 2026 on the legal frameworks across Europe and how they promote or work against women's equality in agriculture. So grass sealing will have information to speak to that call for information, because we are looking at 3 of the legal frameworks across Europe. I'll say a little bit more about those in the next slide. You're here at the Policy Forum. Sorry, if you could go back, Branwen. We're here at the Policy Forum, which is our kind of central tool to engage with policymakers and to inform you about all of our findings, but also to learn from you. You know, I have in the past worked in policy environments, and I know that policy change, while we might like it to be a linear process, is never that. You have to work within the confines of existing policy frameworks. we did this with the Scottish government when when we did research for them. They set up a task force to look at realistically how you might implement some of the findings and when you would revisit after a period of time. I think our living labs are just really exciting, and it's fantastic that they're working so well, and we have such buy-in from rural and farm women. I'm following both the Scottish and the Irish living labs and have learned a lot from women in the labs. And again, I will say a little bit more about that in the next slide, but we're also really focusing on our communication and dissemination plans to get this information out as widely as possible. So Branwen, if you could move to the next slide, I can say a little bit about what we're finding. So we have found gaps in data. I don't think that really should surprise any of us. We still have incomplete information on even ownership of land, and certainly what types of farming women are engaging in, and so on. We still have gaps about the needs of women in rural areas. We are finding that the different gender regimes have a big impact. In Sweden, where parental leave is very well established and must be shared between partners, Sweden is the only country in Europe where having children does not impact on a woman's career. We also see Swedish scholars lamenting that Swedish farm men only take 49 days parental leave, where in some EU countries, that's the statutory kind of entitlement of women. So the different gender regimes have a big impact and will have an impact on how European policies are implemented. We have generated new data. We know that women entrepreneurs more likely get support from family members, whereas men tend to have networks. Childcare is a significant issue for women, and it is not for men. Women tend to start their entrepreneurial activities very, very small and slowly build. They struggle to get access to finance. It's very difficult to get microfinance. A bank is more likely to take seriously an initiative that looks for larger amounts of funding. And I know the Swedish Agricultural Board found that they did this themselves. They did an unconscious gender bias analysis, and they found that with the farm modernization scheme, that women were less likely to be successful because they were asking for less money. We're training 72 innovators across 9 countries, and it's really interesting hearing from them. This question of finance just comes up all of the time. It's really hard for them to access finance. Many of them are not interested in having a large enterprise that employs lots of people. And this is how success is measured. And that's not working for women. Women often want to generate self-employment or maybe employment for 3 or 4 others. And they want to serve a regional market. So I think we need to think differently about how we're judging success. Because if we look at what women are trying to do, many of them are incredibly successful. One of the things that we're seeing on this strategic direction for agriculture seeks to understand the childcare needs of women in rural areas. In the Scottish Highlands and Islands, where our living lab is located, it's very remote. And on many islands, there is no childcare, absolutely no childcare, or very limited provision in parts of the Highlands. And this impacts women's opportunities to participate in the labour market because the expectations are still that childcare is women's responsibility. And what we see in the Highlands is that there are social enterprises developing where women come together to provide childcare for each other and their children so that they can participate in a part-time capacity in the labour market. And I think we really have to think long and hard from a policy level how we are going to support these types of initiatives. It's all very well for policy documents to call for increased rural childcare across Europe. But the reality is the private sector is never going to provide this because it's not going to make a financial return. So I think we need to think about how we can properly reward the development of social enterprises that are providing the infrastructure we need for rural communities to continue, but particularly for gender equality. And yeah, I think there's something interesting in there for policy. As I said, we're benchmarking policy documents. How am I doing on time, by the way? I'm a little bit over. Sorry, I've two more things to say and then I'll be finished. We're benchmarking policy documents at European and national levels. And this is a very interesting process. First of all, there's a European assumption that there's a national equivalent of European documents. That's not always the case. There are no real national equivalents of the long-term vision for rural areas, for example. But we're benchmarking national policies that touch on them. But one of the things we're finding, say particularly with the CAP national plans, is that where they have engaged with activities for women, they tend to be boxed and over on the side, and then they get on with the mainstream business of agriculture without truly integrating equality for women into it. But again, it's a process. So, we have a starting point now, and we'll be able to inform how to maybe make that better. The benchmarking the legal frameworks is ongoing. We're looking at common law, which is prevalent in Ireland and England, where you can basically disinherit children. I rejoice in telling my twin boys I could write one of them out of my will if I wished. We're also looking at the Napoleonic Code of Law, which in theory means assets have to be shared between children. We're also looking at the allodial law, particularly in the Norwegian context, where a provision was made in 1974 that a farm should be left to the eldest child, where you would expect to see then greater gender equality. But in actual fact, what we find is that the legal frameworks are not having any material difference, really, which shows almost that similar to Africa, where there's been a big push for legal rights, that actually it's customary law or cultural and social norms that are more important. The next slide, Branwen, and I'll go through this very quickly. So I think we have a very positive policy forum. We're speaking to the strategic direction of agriculture, and we're speaking about legal frameworks. One of our breakout sessions is on gender budgeting. So I look forward to working with you today.